Keanu Reeves stepped into Aurora, a luxury restaurant known for its exclusivity, his simple attire a stark contrast to the dazzling gowns and tailored suits around him. Vanessa Pierce, the restaurant's senior waitress, took one look at him and smirked. She had already decided he didn't belong. But as she led him to the worst table in the house, dripping with condescension, she had no idea that the man she was belittling held more power than she could ever imagine. What happened next would leave the entire restaurant in stunned silence and change Vanessa's life forever. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. If you love gripping stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Because tomorrow, we've got another incredible tale just for you. The twilight sky cast a golden veil over Los Angeles as Keanu Reeves stepped into Aurora, a bastion of fine dining perched atop the city's glittering sprawl. Dressed in a threadbare leather jacket, faded jeans, and boots scuffed from countless miles, he was a quiet shadow against the restaurant's opulence. Crystal chandeliers gleamed overhead, their light splintering across polished marble floors, illuminating guests draped in couture, sipping wines that cost more than most monthly rents. The air buzzed with the clink of glasses and the murmur of privilege, a world Keanu knew well yet rarely embraced. Famous though he was, tonight he sought only a quiet meal, a fleeting escape from the spotlight. He moved with unassuming grace, his dark eyes scanning the room for a corner to claim. But not everyone saw the man beneath the worn clothes. Some saw only an outsider, unfit for Aurora's gilded embrace. Aurora stood as the undisputed crown jewel of Los Angeles's fine dining scene, a rooftop oasis where the city's elite converged to revel in their own splendor. Perched high above the urban sprawl, its glass walls framed a breathtaking vista of downtown's twinkling lights. The Hollywood Hills, a shadowed silhouette against the amber-streaked sky. Inside, the atmosphere was a carefully orchestrated symphony of luxury. Polished walnut paneling lined the walls, each piece reflecting the chandelier's golden glow, while abstract paintings in muted silvers and golds hung like silent sentinels of taste. A grand piano sat in the corner, its ebony curves catching the light as a musician teased out soft jazz, the notes drifting like smoke through the air. The tables, draped in crisp white linens, gleamed under the flicker of tapered candles, each setting meticulous, silver cutlery aligned with precision, wine glasses sparkling like cut diamonds. The clientele matched the decor, celebrities in tailored suits and shimmering gowns, tech moguls with watches that screamed wealth, and old money heirs whose casual elegance belied fortunes spanning generations. Their laughter tinkled like the clink of their $500-a-bottle vintages, a sound that underscored Aurora's exclusivity. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a stage, a sanctuary where status was both currency and crown. Vanessa Pierce moved through this world with the poise of a queen reigning over her court. At 32, she'd honed her craft over nearly a decade at Aurora, rising from a nervous trainee to a senior waitress whose presence commanded respect, or so she believed. Her black uniform clung to her frame, its sharp lines accentuating her statuesque figure, while her auburn hair, swept into a flawless chignon, gleamed like polished copper under the lights. Her green eyes, sharp and unyielding, darted across the room, assessing each guest with a predator's instinct. To Vanessa, serving at Aurora wasn't merely a job. It was a calling, a privilege she'd earned through years of perfecting her smile, her timing, her ability to anticipate the whims of the powerful. She took pride in her role as gatekeeper, the one who ensured this hallowed space remained unsullied by those who didn't belong. That pride, however, had curdled into something darker, an arrogance that simmered beneath her polished exterior, a belief that Aurora existed solely for the rich, the glamorous, the visibly worthy. She'd seen pretenders before, tourists in ill-fitting clothes, dreamers who thought a reservation could buy them a seat among the elite, and she relished the quiet power of putting them in their place. A raised eyebrow, a subtle barb, a seat near the kitchen where the clatter of pots drowned out the piano's elegance. These were her weapons, wielded with surgical precision. Vanessa didn't just serve, she judged, her mind a ledger that tallied worth by the cut of a jacket, the shine of a shoe, the confidence in a handshake. To her, Aurora was a temple, and she its high priestess, tasked with preserving its sanctity against the unworthy. When her gaze settled on Keanu, seated quietly by the window, that ledger sprang to life. His leather jacket bore creases like battle scars, its edges frayed from years of wear. His jeans, faded to a soft gray, lacked the tailored sheen of designer denim, and his boots, scuffed and unpolished, seemed an affront to the marble beneath them. He sat with his hands folded, his posture relaxed, his dark hair slightly tousled as if he'd just stepped off a motorcycle rather than out of a chauffeured car. Vanessa's lips tightened, her mind racing to a single conclusion. He didn't belong. Not here, not among the glittering throng she'd sworn to protect. He was an intruder, a blemish on Aurora's perfection, and she would ensure he knew it. With a practiced smile that never reached her eyes, she straightened her posture and approached, ready to assert her dominion. Vanessa Pierce stood a few steps from Keanu's table, her tray balanced effortlessly in one hand as she sized him up with a practiced eye. The faint hum of the piano lingered in the air, but it did little to soften the sharpness in her gaze. Keanu looked up, catching her stare, and offered a polite nod. "Good evening," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying a warmth that seemed out of place in Aurora's icy grandeur. "I'd like a table, please." Her response was immediate, a slow, deliberate sweep of her eyes from his scuffed boots to his tousled hair, her lips curling into a smirk that barely masked her disdain. She tilted her head, the gesture almost theatrical, as if she were appraising a stray who'd wandered into a palace. "Good evening," she replied, her tone smooth but laced with a venomous edge. "Are you sure you're in the right place? Aurora isn't exactly, well, it's not for everyone." The condescension hung heavy in her words, a barb designed to sting, and she let her smirk widen as she glanced toward a nearby table. A woman in a sequined gown caught her eye and stifled a chuckle, feeding Vanessa's quiet triumph. Keanu's expression didn't falter. His dark eyes met hers, calm and unyielding, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I'm sure," he said simply, his voice a steady counterpoint to her rising scorn. "This is where I'd like to be." Vanessa let out a short, incredulous laugh, a sound sharp enough to pierce the dining room's polished hum, drawing the attention of a couple sipping champagne nearby. "All right then," she said, her voice dripping with mock courtesy. "Follow me." She turned on her heel, her movements crisp and purposeful, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome marking her disdain. She didn't lead him to the main dining area, where the chandeliers cast a golden glow over tables adorned with orchids and the view stretched toward the twinkling Hollywood hills. Instead, she guided him to a shadowed corner near the kitchen doors, where the air buzzed with the clatter of dishwashing and the faint hiss of steam. The table was small, its surface slightly worn, a stark contrast to the pristine elegance elsewhere. She gestured to it with a flourish, her smile a parody of sweetness. "I think you'll feel comfortable here," she said, her tone syrupy and insincere. "It's nice and discreet." Keanu settled into the chair, his posture relaxed as he glanced out the window at the city's fading light. "Thank you," he said, his voice even, betraying no hint of the slight she'd intended. "This works fine." Her smirk flickered, a spark of irritation flashing in her eyes. She'd expected a reaction, discomfort, embarrassment, anything, but his calm denied her the victory she craved. With a curt nod, she spun away, her muttered words trailing behind her as she passed the champagne-sipping couple. "He'll be out of here in 5 minutes. Just watch." Minutes later, Vanessa returned, her tray now empty, her demeanor sharpened by the thrill of her earlier jab. She approached Keanu's table with a menu tucked under her arm, but instead of handing it over, she hesitated, swapping it for the slim drinks list instead. She slid it across the table with a flick of her wrist, her painted nail tapping the page insistently. "You might want to start here," she said, her voice a blend of suggestion and scorn. "The house water's free and we've got some sodas that won't break the bank." Her smirk returned, a glint of amusement dancing in her eyes as she waited for him to falter. Keanu glanced at the list, a sparse collection of soft drinks and budget beers, then set it aside with a gentle push. He reached for the menu she'd left within arm's reach, flipping it open with a casual ease that belied her expectations. His eyes scanned the pages, lingering on dishes that read like poetry. Caviar-dusted scallops, truffle-infused risotto, entrees crowned with edible gold. "I'll have the Wagyu steak," he said, his tone steady as he pointed to the item near the top. "And a glass of the 1998 Chateau Margaux." Vanessa blinked, her smirk freezing in place as the words sank in. The Wagyu was a $500 masterpiece, a tender cut seared to perfection, its marbling a work of art, while the Chateau Margaux, a 1998 vintage from Bordeaux's hallowed vineyards, carried a $300 price tag per glass. She leaned forward slightly, her laughter a brittle edge on her breath. "Just so you're aware," she said, her voice thick with mockery. "That's one of our most exclusive items. The steak's $500, and the wine, well, let's just say it's not cheap. Would you like me to go over the prices again? Make sure you're comfortable with it." Keanu met her gaze, his smile softening the sting of her words. "No need," he said, handing the menu back to her with a nod. "That's what I'd like." Her amusement curdled into annoyance, her smirk twisting into something sharper. "All right then," she snapped, scribbling the order with exaggerated strokes, her pen digging into the notepad. "Your choice." She turned away, her heels striking the floor with a vengeance as she headed toward the kitchen. But she didn't hurry. Instead, she detoured to a VIP table near the center, where a tech mogul in a bespoke suit waved her over. She lingered there, laughing at his tepid joke about cryptocurrency, her tray balanced casually as she recounted the day's specials. Keanu's order sat unsubmitted, a silent rebellion against the man she deemed unworthy. When she finally reached the kitchen, she tossed the ticket to Carlos, the expediter, with a scoff. "Wagyu and Chateau Margaux," she said, rolling her eyes. "Bet he can't even pronounce it. He's just pretending." Carlos glanced at the slip, then at her, his brow creasing. "Maybe he knows what he's doing, Vanessa. Give him a break." "A break?" she retorted, folding her arms. "He's out of his league. He'll choke when he sees the bill. I guarantee it. She strutted back to the dining room, her confidence unshaken, determined to see Keanu unravel under the weight of his own audacity. But as she passed his table, his calm gaze followed her, a quiet challenge she couldn't ignore. Time stretched languidly as Keanu sat at his shadowed table near the kitchen, the minutes piling up like the faint wisps of steam escaping through the swinging doors behind him. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the table while the other traced the condensation on his water glass. The cityscape beyond the window glimmered through the twilight, a mosaic of amber and indigo that softened the edges of Los Angeles's relentless sprawl. Inside Aurora, the piano's jazz melodies wove a gentle thread through the air, their notes rising and falling like a heartbeat against the clink of crystal and the murmur of privileged voices. The chandelier light danced across the marble floor, casting fleeting reflections that seemed to mock the stillness of his corner. Keanu observed it all with a quiet curiosity, the elegance, the excess, the unspoken rules of this gilded world, his dark eyes taking in every detail without judgment. He was patient, a man accustomed to waiting, content to let the evening unfold at its own pace. At a nearby table, Mr. and Mrs. Langford, a couple in their 50s draped in understated wealth, began to notice the oddity of his solitude. Mrs. Langford, her silk blouse shimmering faintly under the lights, leaned toward her husband, her brow creasing with concern. "That waitress is treating him terribly," she whispered, her voice soft but laced with indignation. "He's just sitting there so polite and she's ignoring him completely." Mr. Langford, his tailored blazer crisp and his glass of Pinot Noir half empty, nodded slowly, his gaze flickering toward Keanu. "It's strange," he murmured. "She's fawning over everyone else but acting like he's invisible. Something's not right." Across the room, Mr. Dawson, an elderly gentleman with silver hair and a cane propped against his chair, watched the scene with a sharper focus. His blue eyes, framed by lines etched from decades of observation, narrowed as he tracked Vanessa's movements. He'd been a regular at Aurora for years, his quiet demeanor belying a keen awareness of its rhythms and its injustices. His fingers tightened around the stem of his wine glass as he noted Keanu's patience, the way the man sat unfazed by the clatter of dishes and the waitress's blatant neglect. "Unfair," he muttered under his breath, his voice a low rumble of disapproval. He sensed something deeper at play, a thread of dignity in Keanu's calm that Vanessa seemed determined to unravel. The unease rippled outward, a soft undercurrent stirring the dining room. A young woman in a red dress, seated with her date near the piano, tilted her head, her earrings catching the light as she whispered, "Why's she ignoring that guy? He's not bothering anyone." Her companion shrugged, but his eyes lingered on Keanu, confusion creasing his brow. At another table, a group of influencers paused their selfie-taking, their hushed voices carrying fragments of speculation. "Maybe he didn't tip last time," one suggested. "Or he's some weirdo," another countered. The whispers grew, a quiet chorus of curiosity and discomfort, as Keanu remained an island of serenity amid the rising tide of attention. Vanessa, meanwhile, swept through the dining room with a confidence that bordered on theater, her tray laden with flutes of champagne and plates of amuse-bouches for the guests she deemed worthy. She passed Keanu's table once, twice, 3 times, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm against the marble, her eyes deliberately averted, as if he were a ghost she refused to acknowledge. Each time she breezed by, the clatter of the kitchen grew louder in his corner. The bang of pots, the barked orders of the sous chef, a discordant soundtrack to her silent dismissal. She paused near a table of wealthy regulars, a cluster of men in bespoke suits and women dripping in diamonds, and let out a bright, exaggerated laugh at a banal quip about private jets. Leaning in, she lowered her voice just enough to carry, her words a calculated dart aimed at Keanu's unseen ears. "We get all kinds of people thinking they can just walk in here," she said, her smirk flashing as she glanced sidelong toward his table. "Like they belong with the rest of us." The men chuckled, one raising his glass in mock salute, while the women tittered behind manicured hands. Vanessa basked in their approval, her pride swelling as she reinforced her dominion over Aurora's sacred space. She moved on, delivering a tray of oysters to the influencers, her laughter ringing out again as she posed for a quick photo. Anything to delay the inevitable return to the man she'd relegated to the margins. When she finally brought Keanu's Wagyu steak and Chateau Margaux, nearly 40 minutes after his order, she approached with a carelessness that bordered on defiance. The plate hit the table with a sharp clatter, the porcelain skidding an inch as a drizzle of truffle sauce splashed onto the cloth. The wineglass followed, its deep ruby contents sloshing dangerously close to the rim before settling. "Here you go," she said, her tone thick with sarcasm, her smirk a blade honed to cut. "Hope you enjoy it, if it's your kind of thing." The words lingered, a taunt disguised as service, her eyes daring him to react. Keanu looked up, his expression as serene as ever, the faint smile still tugging at his lips. "Thank you," he said, his voice a quiet balm against her venom. "It looks excellent." He reached for his fork, his movements deliberate, as if the chaos of her disrespect couldn't touch the calm he carried within. Vanessa's smirk faltered, irritation flaring in her chest, like a struck match. She'd wanted a crack in his facade, anger, embarrassment, anything to justify her scorn, but his politeness was a wall she couldn't breach. "Sure," she muttered, her voice barely audible as she turned away, her heels striking the floor with renewed force. She passed the Langfords' table, her muttered words trailing behind her like a bitter aftertaste. "He's got no idea what he's in for. Probably thinks it's a burger joint." Mrs. Langford gasped softly, her hand fluttering to her pearls, while Mr. Langford's jaw tightened, his gaze hardening as Vanessa strutted back to her chosen flock. Keanu's calm only fueled her fire, a challenge she was determined to win, no matter the cost. The air in Aurora thickened as Keanu lingered over the final bite of his Wagyu steak, its rich, truffle-laced flavor a stark contrast to the bitter undercurrent swirling around his table. The candle's flame guttered violently, casting jagged shadows across the stained tablecloth, a silent testament to Vanessa's earlier disdain. She stormed back toward him, her heels striking the marble like gunshots, her smirk now a feral grin, sharpened by the thrill of her hunt. She slammed her hands onto the table's edge, leaning in close enough for him to catch the faint scent of her perfume, floral, but edged with something acrid. "So," she hissed, her voice a venomous whip cracking through the dining room's hum. "How's the meal? Did it meet your expectations?" The word was a taunt, spat out with enough force to turn heads, her green eyes blazing as she loomed over him, daring him to break. Keanu didn't flinch. He set his fork down with a slow, deliberate clink that echoed like a gavel in the charged silence. His gaze lifted to hers, dark and fathomless, a storm held in check by an unshakable calm. His faint smile sharpened into something steely, a quiet defiance that cut deeper than any shout. "It's excellent," he said, his voice low but booming with an authority that seemed to rattle the crystal chandeliers. "You should let the chef know. It's perfectly prepared. The wine, too. A masterpiece." Each syllable landed like a stone, heavy and unyielding, stripping away the armor of her scorn. Vanessa recoiled as if slapped, her smirk twisting into a snarl before crumbling entirely. She'd lunged for a fight, expecting him to cower or snap, but his composure was a wall of iron she couldn't dent. Her breath hitched, panic clawing at her throat as she straightened, her hands trembling against the table. "Fine," she spat, her voice shrill, fracturing under the weight of his gaze. The room tilted. Mr. and Mrs. Langford froze, their forks clattering to their plates. Mr. Dawson's wine glass hit the table with a thud, his eyes wide with anticipation. The woman in the red dress gripped her date's arm, whispering, "He's not just taking it, he's winning." The diners leaned in, a collective heartbeat pounding as the energy shifted, Vanessa's dominance unraveling in the face of Keanu's quiet power. The tension snapped like a taut wire as Olivia Harrington burst through the side entrance, her navy suit a streak of shadow against Aurora's golden glow. Her auburn hair strained against its bun, tendrils escaping as if mirroring the chaos she sensed. She'd been pacing her office, the busboy's frantic report. "Mr. Dawson says she's humiliating a guest," ringing in her ears. Now her hazel eyes blazed as they swept the room, locking onto Keanu's table where Vanessa stood, her posture rigid with defiance. Olivia's breath caught, her chest tightening as recognition hit her like a thunderclap. Keanu Reeves. Her calm shattered, replaced by a raw, visceral urgency as she charged forward, her heels hammering the marble in a relentless staccato that drowned out the piano's fading wail. "Mr. Reeves!" she cried, her voice slicing through the room, shrill with reverence and dread. She skidded to a halt beside him, nearly knocking over a chair, her hands clasped in a pleading gesture. "I had no idea you were here tonight. Is everything, God, is everything to your satisfaction?" Her words tumbled out, desperate, her posture bowing as if before a king, her eyes darting between Keanu and the stunned diners. The dining room imploded into silence, a void so absolute it sucked the air from every lung. Glasses crashed to tables, wine splashing like blood. Forks tumbled from shaking hands, clanging against porcelain. The Langfords gaped, Mrs. Langford's pearls rattling as she clutched them. Mr. Dawson slammed his cane against the floor, a sharp crack of vindication. The woman in the red dress shrieked, "Reeves!" her voice a piercing arrow that ricocheted through the crowd. Every eye bore into Keanu, the weight of their stares a spotlight on Vanessa's trembling form. Her smirk was gone, obliterated, her face a ghastly white as if drained by a specter. Her knees buckled, her hands clawing at the table for support as Olivia's words, "Mr. Reeves," echoed in her skull like a death knell. Keanu Reeves, the icon. And then Olivia's reverence twisted the knife deeper. Co-owner. Vanessa's world collapsed, the marble floor seeming to tilt beneath her as the truth roared in. Every sneer, every careless drop of his plate. Every barbed word had been aimed at the man who'd built Aurora. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her eyes wild as she staggered back, the room's silence a crushing verdict. Olivia whirled on her, fury erupting like a volcano. "Vanessa!" she bellowed, her voice a raw, guttural roar that shook the walls. "What the hell is this? You didn't know? Or you didn't care?" Her hands balled into fists, her glare a guillotine poised to fall. Vanessa's mouth opened, a choked whimper escaping. I didn't..." But Olivia cut her off, stepping closer, her shadow swallowing Vanessa whole. "You've disgraced us!" The diners recoiled, whispers exploding into a cacophony of disgust, as Vanessa stood exposed, her reign shattered by the man she dared to scorn. Vanessa stumbled back from Keanu's table, her heels scraping the marble as if the floor itself were pulling her under. Her face was a mask of ash, her green eyes wide and darting like a trapped animal's, her breaths coming in short, ragged bursts. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice cracking, a pitiful whine that clawed at the silence. "I thought he didn't look. I thought—" Her hands flailed, grasping at air, at excuses, at anything to shield her from the avalanche of her own making. The words tumbled out, incoherent and desperate, each one a shovel digging her deeper into the pit she'd carved. Olivia Harrington loomed over her, a storm incarnate, her hazel eyes blazing with a fury that could melt steel. "You thought?" she snapped, her voice a jagged blade slicing through Vanessa's babble, sharp enough to make the chandelier tremble. She stepped forward, her shadow swallowing Vanessa whole, her fists clenched at her sides. "You thought he was beneath our service? That he didn't deserve respect?" Her tone rose, a thunderclap that reverberated through Aurora, shaking the polished veneer of the room. "You insulted the man who owns this place, our co-founder, and you stand there whining about what you thought?" Her lips curled into a sneer, disgust dripping from every word, her authority a guillotine poised above Vanessa's neck. The diners recoiled, a wave of revulsion rippling through the crowd. Mr. Langford shook his head, his jaw tight, muttering, "Unbelievable." Mrs. Langford clutched her pearls, her whisper cutting through the hush. "She's a disgrace." Mr. Dawson tapped his cane against the floor, a slow, deliberate rhythm like a judge's gavel, his silver brows furrowed in contempt. The woman in the red dress hissed to her date, "She's done, completely done." Her voice a venomous thread in the growing chorus of disgust. Vanessa shrank under their stares, the weight of their judgment a physical force pressing her down, her kingdom of pride crumbling into dust. Keanu rose from his chair, his movement slow and deliberate, a titan unfolding in the midst of the chaos. The leather jacket creaked faintly as he straightened, his presence filling the room like a quiet storm, commanding every eye without a single raised word. He turned to Vanessa, his dark gaze locking onto hers, not with anger, but with a calm authority that cut deeper than any shout. She flinched, her shoulders hunching as if to shield herself, but there was no escaping the weight of his stare. "It shouldn't take knowing who someone is to treat them with basic decency," he said, his voice steady, each word a stone dropped into the silence, rippling outward with unshakable conviction. "You didn't need my name to see me as a person, but you chose not to." Vanessa's head jerked away, her eyes dropping to the floor, tears pooling as shame burned through her. His words were a mirror, forcing her to face the ugliness she'd wielded so freely, her arrogance, her cruelty, her blind judgment, all laid bare in the quiet power of his rebuke. The room held its breath, the diners leaning forward, hanging on his every syllable, the air thick with the gravity of his truth. Keanu shifted his gaze to Olivia, his tone firm but measured. "We need to have a staff meeting after closing," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly, a flicker of resolve cutting through his calm. "This can't happen again." Olivia nodded sharply, her jaw tight, her fury still simmering but now tempered by his command. Vanessa stood frozen, a broken figure in the wreckage of her own making, as Keanu's words echoed like a final verdict. The dining room of Aurora lay silent after closing, its grandeur muted, the chandeliers casting a faint, somber glow over the gathered staff. They stood in a tense semicircle, uniforms disheveled, faces taut with the weight of the night. Keanu anchored the center, his leather jacket slung over a chair, his presence a steady force amid the lingering storm. His dark eyes roamed the room, chefs, busboys, servers, before locking onto Vanessa at the back. She stood apart, her head bowed, auburn hair spilling loose from its once perfect chignon, her hands trembling as tears streaked her face, regret carving deep lines into her expression. "We don't judge people by what they wear," Keanu began, his voice cutting through the stillness with a quiet power, each word a lifeline thrown into the wreckage. "Or assume their worth by appearances. Aurora isn't a fortress for the elite. It's a place for everyone who steps inside." Vanessa's flinch was visible, her shoulders hunching as his words pierced her pride. "Kindness isn't about grand gestures," he continued, his tone softening yet resolute. "It's in the everyday. How you greet someone, how you serve them, how you choose to see them beyond the surface." He paused, his gaze steady on her. "Tonight was a failure of that. But it's not the end. It's a chance to start over." Vanessa lifted her head, her voice a broken whisper. "I'm sorry," she said, the words raw, spilling out as she met his eyes. "I was wrong, horribly wrong. I saw a stranger, not a person. I'll change, I swear it." Her promise trembled, but it held a spark of resolve, a fragile seed planted in the ashes of her arrogance. Keanu nodded, a faint smile breaking through. "That's all it takes," he said, "a choice to do better." Keanu stepped into the Los Angeles night, pausing at Aurora's entrance as the cool air brushed his face. The city pulsed beyond, its lights a jagged dance against the dark, traffic a distant rumble. He glanced back at the quiet restaurant, its lessons echoing in his mind. Not just a clash, but a mirror of human frailty and strength. Vanessa's tearful vow lingered with him, a sign that even the hardest hearts could bend. In a world where you can be anything, choose to be kind. It hung in the air, a quiet command. Keanu walked away, his boots fading into the neon haze, leaving a message carved in the night. Empathy isn't tied to rank. It's a choice, a strength born in the smallest acts. Vanessa learned that tonight, not through punishment, but through the grace of being seen anew. The story closed with a call to rise above. Every moment offers a chance to judge or to lift. Choose to lift, to see the unseen, to mend what's broken. That's the legacy worth building, in a restaurant or a life.